Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Understanding AuDHD Burnout, How Neurodivergent Masking Sparks Stress and Exhaustion. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Amy Marschall. Dr. Marschall is a licensed psychologist, author, and speaker. She is an expert in neurodiversity affirming care, especially for the autistic and ADHD communities. She's the author of several books, including the newly published Neurodiversity Affirming Therapy, What Every Mental Health Provider Needs to Know. Dr. Marschall was diagnosed as AuDHD as an adult and is an advocate for her communities, bringing both professional and personal expertise. She has mental health resources and continuing education courses for therapists on her website, which is www.resiliencamentalhealth.com, and you can see that on your screen there. We would love to begin today's webinar by asking two poll questions to our live audience that will help steer the Q&A later. Which of the following factors do you feel contributes most to your burnout episodes? Please select up to 3 choices, and you can always tell us more in the comments box under the video player. And then give us an idea of, in the last year, how many burnout episodes you have experienced. For answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, you can click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen at any time. For reading to supplement today's webinar, I would like to recommend a few articles from the brand new summer issue of ADDitude magazine, our first ever women's issue. On page 10, Dr. Karen Saporito shares advice for navigating the autism evaluation process, especially when you feel unheard. She also explains the common misdiagnoses given to autistic girls and women with ADHD. And within our feature package, the ADHD Women's Revolution, Dr. Kathleen Nadeau outlines 10 steps for unmasking, avoiding burnout, and building a life that works for your ADHD brain. That appears on page 56. Subscribers, your issues are in the mail now. If you are not yet a subscriber to ADDitude magazine, sign up today and you will get 15% off your subscription. Just click the link on your screen. You will also get a free copy of the ADDitude ebook, How the ADHD Brain Works. Finally, the sponsor of today's webinar is Inflow. Masking your neurodivergence is exhausting, but you don't have to hide who you are. Inflow gets it and is here to support you. Their science-backed app is built by leading ADHD clinicians and can help you embrace your AuDHD, reduce burnout, and build resilience. Ready to drop the mask and thrive? Start by clicking the link on your screen to take Inflow's free ADHD traits quiz today. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. Okay, without any further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Amy Marschall. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this amazing discussion.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. Before we get started, just for transparency, I did create this presentation in collaboration with ADDitude. When I'm not here, I am the owner and the sole person in my private practice, Resiliency Mental Health. I'm also clinical director of A Change for Better, which is a mental health organization in New Zealand. And then, as you heard in my introduction, I am a licensed psychologist, I am a speaker, I am an author, and I am AuDHD myself. So I know this personally, and I know this professionally, and I'm very excited to get to talk to all of you today. I will try not to talk rapid fire because I've got a lot of thoughts. So starting off, so we want to talk a bit about, obviously our topic today is burnout. and that neurodivergent experience of burnout. And neurodivergent burnout is not recognized as its own clinical diagnosis at this point, but burnout as a concept is recognized. Occupational burnout is recognized in the International Classification of Diseases. And also there's a lot of research supporting that neurodivergent folks, including autistic, ADHD, and AuDHD, have a unique burnout experience that's different than the burnout experiences of other neurotypes. One of the reasons for that is masking, sometimes called camouflaging. And by that, I don't mean wearing a mask like the teddy bear in the picture here. I mean that hiding of your neurodivergent traits. Not everyone masks, but most people do. And even people who are completely neurotypical will mask. I say all the time, you probably don't talk to your best friend the same way that you talk to your boss. We have, a lot of people talk about their customer service voice or their work face. And there is a sometimes adaptive need to say, this is how I'm presenting in this setting. But neurodivergent masking is distinct from that because it's we live in a society that's very neuronormative. The assumption is neurotypical is the ideal, is the best. Everyone is neurotypical until demonstrated otherwise, and those who are not neurotypical should try to align with neurotypical behaviors. So when you're neurodivergent, you're not masking because this is how I behave in this setting. You're masking who I am authentically is not accepted. So I need to tweak that. I need to suppress and hide that part of myself in order to fit in. And never dropping that mask is in itself exhausting. It is not sustainable to be in that headspace all the time. And also that constant message that your authentic self is unacceptable really wears you down, and it wears your self-esteem. It causes depression and anxiety. It's generally like, it's not good to not feel that your authentic self is acceptable. So I want to talk a little bit about some common questions that I see that relate to neurodivergent masking. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but it's something that I hear a lot and that I get asked when I do these kinds of talks. A lot of people who are not AuDHD, but have a loved one who is, will ask me, how can I help my loved one to unmask? And first and foremost, that's a very, it's kind, compassionate, comes from an admirable place to want your loved one to feel safe unmasking with you. However, I want to emphasize you need to be a safe person to receive them unmasked before you go about trying to get them to show you that side of themselves. I can tell you from my own personal experience, and I can tell you that many people that I know have shared with me experiences of someone told me that they wanted to know me unmasked, and so I unmasked around them, and then they rejected me. And that's worse than just saying, okay, you know what, I can't handle you unmasked, that rejection. So don't make that offer unless you seriously mean it. When I am fully unmasked, I stim in ways that people might find annoying or weird. I talk about my interests, I info dump. People might find that, again, annoying, odd, unusual. Why are you doing that? So if we start to unmask, it's that web comic of the person coming out of the box and then getting punched. And so they go back in the box and they make the box thicker so that they're like, I'm not trying that again. It's so like, you need to genuinely mean that I do truly accept you as you are unmasked before you present yourself as someone that they can unmask to. Don't be telling us, oh, that's annoying, that's weird, why are you doing that? And also telling us, I want you to feel safe unmasking around me, because those two things cannot coexist. Many neurodivergent individuals will ask, I've noticed that masking has gotten harder for me over time. Is masking more difficult when you get older? Masking takes a lot of energy and it really, really wears on you. And so over time, it can be harder to maintain that simply because you are exhausted and you don't have the capacity to continue to uphold that. So that definitely can be a contributing factor to masking getting more difficult. Masking causes burnout, again, because it is exhausting and you're constantly overextending yourself and it reaches that point where you simply can't do it anymore. So unmasking and learning who you are unmasked both take a lot of practice and thought and care and like awareness, because if you've been doing it for as long as you can remember, you might not even know fully who you are when you're not masking. So it takes that practice and it takes time and it takes thought and care and experimenting with who am I when I'm not consciously trying to be who I think you want me or expect me to be. So it is definitely, it's not something that you can do in an afternoon, but it definitely takes some time to build that up and to develop that comfort. So let's talk a little bit about autism and ADHD and AuDHD, which is the term that we use to refer to someone who's autistic and ADHD. So there is overlap. There are autistic traits that can also be ADHD traits. There are autistic people who are not ADHD. There are ADHD folks who are not autistic, and there are people who are both. And actually, what the research has found is that being autistic or ADHD increases the likelihood that you are both. So there are people who are just one or the other, but if you are one, you're more likely to be both than someone who is neither. So like essentially, depending on which statistic you read, about 10% of everybody is ADHD, but about 50 to 80% of autistics are ADHD. So it really increases the probability, basically. And actually, I don't know if fun fact is the right term here, but the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the list of all the diagnoses, actually until 2013, said officially that AuDHD did not exist. You were autistic or ADHD, but you could not be both. So, I mean, the people in my role are still learning what these things are and what they look like and how they're similar and different to each other. And I mean, there's even some now theorizing that autism and ADHD are parts of the same neurotype, that it might be that these are both under the same umbrella versus being two distinct things. So I'm interested to see kind of how that progresses as, over time in the future. So this is a little graphic that I've put together. For the sake of time, I won't read through the whole thing, but essentially there are traits that we see with ADHD that are not inherently autistic traits. There are autistic traits that are not inherently ADHD, and then there are traits that are a little bit of both. You'll notice if you read through both of these lists, you can't see me pointing at it with my mouse. I don't know why I did that. There are traits that seem completely contradictory to each other, like ADHD craving novelty in your schedule, autism needing sameness, needing routine. And you can have both of those at the same time because it can be very complicated. It can be these things, I need novelty, but these things need to stay the same. Or it can even be a battle within my own brain of I need sameness, but I also need novelty, and I'm in conflict with myself and I'm overstimulating myself trying to get both. This also makes diagnosis more difficult because a lot of the research on the measures that people with my job use to figure out who's autistic, who's ADHD, and who's AuDHD really look at, we normed this measure. So we tested this measure, we use it to decide who has ADHD. But when we studied the measure, we only studied people who had ADHD and were not autistic. So it can make the diagnosis more complicated because the diagnosticians don't get the training in what that overlap looks like and how that can manifest. And that can lead to people being misdiagnosed because the evaluator says, well, I don't see that need for sameness because of this executive dysfunction, but they're not recognizing that it's the AuDHD, it's that overlap, that combination. So to give a little bit of information on if there are folks here today who are considering being assessed, there's no one set assessment for ADHD, autism, or AuDHD. And in fact, the diagnostic criteria specifically says the diagnosis is assigned when the qualified clinician feels that there's enough evidence. There is no ADHD test. There is no autism test. There are tests that help inform us of whether the criteria are met, but there's no make or break. You elevated on this measure, or on the flip side, you didn't elevate on this measure and therefore you're not. There's just simply tools and data that we use to pull all of this together and to give us a picture of what this individual's experience is and how that impacts their neurotype. And because there's no set test, that leads to a couple of things. That leads to some providers going way over the top and saying we need to do 15 hours of all this in-depth testing and all these different measures. And me looking at that assessment and saying, why'd you need this? Like, why did we need this much? But then you also get, I'm going to just ask you 6 questions and call it good. And really, we need enough information to be confident, but not so much information that I'm putting you through things you don't need to be put through. Another thing that's challenging with diagnostic assessments is a lot of that research focuses on children, and there's not as much out there for those of us. I was diagnosed in my 30s. So there's not enough out there on what autism, ADHD, and AuDHD look like once you're an adult. I mean, there's kind of a joke within communities that a comment that I've gotten and that a lot of other autistic people have gotten is, well, my 6-year-old nephew's autistic and he doesn't act like you. And I'm like, yes, I don't act like your 6-year-old nephew because I am not 6 years old. I'm in my 30s. Not to mention that each person is an individual and we all present differently simply because that's what being an individual is. That's how that goes. So, it gets difficult with the diagnosis when you get providers who get stuck in this really rigid thought of it has to look this particular way. And misdiagnosis is a huge issue, especially with AuDHD communities, with adults, with anyone who's not a white male, basically. So I want to talk a little bit, and actually, I'd like to say I made this slide before certain news events happened in recent weeks that have made this even more appropriate. So I want to start off by saying an official assessment, an official diagnosis by a provider is not necessarily a choice that you're going to make for yourself. ADHD, autism, AuDHD are what we call neurodevelopmental. That means you're born with them. That means that I'm autistic now. That means that I was autistic when I was 2 years old. I was autistic when I was 6 years old. I was autistic when I was 10 years old. We just didn't know it then. So if you are, you always have been, whether that's been validated by a professional or not. There can be a need for a professional to validate and to confirm the neurotype. For example, if you're a student or you're in a job where you need certain accommodations and you're not able to get those accommodations without that official documentation. If you have ADHD and you want to consider medication to manage some of those traits that maybe cause challenges for you in your life, you need the official diagnosis in order to consider medication as a treatment option for you. You might know, okay, I see a lot of these traits in me, but what does that mean for what's going to be most beneficial to me as an individual? The assessment can provide that personalized information. Most autistic, ADHD, and AuDHD folks have at least one additional diagnosis: depression, anxiety, trauma, mood disorders, etc. Most of us have at least one additional something going on. When it comes to self-diagnosis or self-identifying, essentially, if you haven't been evaluated officially, professionally, whatever terminology you are the most comfortable with, there is an argument to be made for the professional can make sure that you're correct when you say, I resonate with these traits. However, there is research that shows that in the autistic community, especially, people who really resonate with those autistic traits tend to meet criteria for autism. And a tricky thing with neurodivergence is that brain. Your brain's job is to give you information, and that includes information about yourself. And there are forms of neurodivergence that by their nature can make it harder to accurately assess yourself. For example, any neurodivergence that might come with what we call difficulty with reality testing. It might be more difficult for me to realize that my brain is not giving me accurate information. However, for the autistic community specifically, the research shows that autistic brain tends to be pretty good at identifying itself. So often if you not like, oh yeah, everybody, fidgets sometimes, but like if you're finding yourself really, really resonating with those traits, it is very possible that you're autistic. So, and also, even if you're not autistic and you show a lot of autistic traits and accommodations and supports that autistic people benefit from help you use those supports. So if you're self-accommodating, it doesn't hurt me in any way for someone who might be neurotypical, for example, to be using a stim toy. And if anything, I like that more people use stim toys in public because it makes it less obvious when I'm using one right now while I'm talking to you, because otherwise I would not be sitting still in my chair. So, excuse me, you can self-accommodate without having a professional issue that diagnosis. But there are possible situations where someone might need that in their record. Now, at the same time, there are risks that come with getting an official assessment. They're very expensive. They're often not covered by insurance. It's hard to find a provider who's qualified to conduct the assessment. Even if you do find a provider who is qualified, they're often specializing in working with children. It's hard to find someone who's qualified and understands your demographics specifically, especially if you're an adult. Also, people say self-diagnosis can be inaccurate. Well, so can official diagnosis. To share, I was actually assessed twice because I was misdiagnosed the first time that I was tested. I had to find a second provider who was qualified and pay for a whole new assessment to get the correct answer. So self-diagnosis can be wrong, but so can official diagnosis. Big issue that's been coming up lately is if you get an official diagnosis, that often becomes part of your official medical record. And there is nothing bad, wrong, or shameful about being AuDHD. And also we can face discrimination. There are countries that will not accept autistic immigrants. There are states in the United States on a state level that keep lists of autistic people who live in that state. There's talk of doing that nationally, which honestly scares me quite a bit. So for some people, an official diagnosis carries more risks than it does benefits. So if they don't feel safe with that risk of having it on their official record, that's a valid concern. Looking at, like I said, most AuDHD, most autistic, most ADHD folks have at least one additional diagnosis. And also, we are more likely to have many different diagnoses compared to neurotypical populations. Some of that is because, again, you're born ADHD, you're born autistic. The biggest predictor of those things is the genetic link. So there's a very good chance, by the way, if you're autistic, ADHD, or AuDHD, that you've got at least one parent who is as well. If you have a child who is, there's a good chance that either you or that child's other parent is as well. Excuse me. It's very rare to be the only one in the family. Not impossible, but uncommon. And many of these other diagnoses have genetic components. There can be, they can be environmental, but there's genetic predisposition to depression. There's genetic predisposition to learning disorders. And even the things that are not, the PTSD, you're not going to have, there is epigenetics that comes with trauma. That's a topic for another day, but basically you're not born with PTSD. But when you're neurodivergent, you are at higher risk for traumatic experiences that can cause PTSD. So there's the genetic piece. We're more likely to just have these other things because of our genetics. And also, it's stressful to exist in a world that's not designed for you. And we are at higher risk for trauma because of our, not because of our neurodivergence in like a week, but when you don't fit into the box, you are then more exposed and more at risk for harm due to discrimination, due to abuse. There's increased risk for all these other things when you're already neurodivergent. So to shift back a little bit to talk more about burnout, like I said, autistic burnout, neurodivergent burnout is not formally recognized as its own mental health diagnosis, but it is identified in the research as a thing that exists. We know that it is a phenomenon that is unique to these neurodivergent communities. And it's caused essentially by, and I like this wording, a mismatch of expectations and abilities without adequate supports. So if what I am capable of independently and what is expected of me don't match, and I'm constantly overextending myself, I'm constantly at my limit, going beyond my limit because I want to meet these expectations. That is exhausting and it wears you down over time. And autistic burnout used to be framed as the word that was used was regression, because it was marked as you're acting more autistic. Because when you hit your limit and you can't mask like that anymore, more of those traits start to come out. So, they say like reduced tolerance to stimulus. A lot of autistic people who are experiencing burnout or who have experienced burnout talk about sensory sensitivities getting worse when they're in burnout. And is it that my sensory issues are worse? Or is it that I was forcing myself to ignore my sensory needs because it wasn't considered acceptable to express them? And now that I can't mask and pretend that it's not bothering me, I'm no longer at the capacity, have the ability to present as if it's not bothering me, even though it always was. So that's also a question of, I hate this phrase, but, when can you get back to normal? When you've experienced burnout, when can you get back to where you were before you were in burnout? Well, if that environment is the reason you burned out, then it's not feasible to go back to that. because you can't thrive in the environment that made you sick. You're just going to get sick again. So it's not going to, it's going to just come right back. And so, there's kind of a thought of, after burnout, are there permanent limitations that are caused by the burnout? Well, a lot of people who have been through burnout don't go back to normal, but is that because they lost that ability, or is that because that was never sustainable for them in the first place? And so now they're making more long-term changes to ensure that they don't fall right back into burnout as soon as they're done. So what does neurodivergent burnout look like? There are different symptom combinations that we talk about. And I mean, obviously, I'm not going to list every possible symptom with the time that we have, but physical symptoms can include literally being in pain, headaches, stomach aches, general achiness, neurological issues, cognitive issues, difficulty learning new things, difficulty with memory, executive dysfunction. So like disorganization, losing things, attention problems, new or worsening, social symptoms, withdrawal, more difficulty tolerating social environments that I maybe participated in before. Emotional issues like becoming dysregulated or experiencing depression. And then, like I alluded to before, reduced ability to cope with sensory sensitivities. And a big risk of burnout, it does link to depression, anxiety, all those things. Burnout can lead, unfortunately, to suicide, either ideation or action. And so it's very important to get people the support they need before they develop burnout, and also to address, for their well-being, and honestly, like for their life. Like this can quite literally be life and death for some people. So to answer some questions I get a lot about burnout, depression and burnout can look similar. And actually, it was previously thought that burnout was a form of depression and not a distinct thing. Depression is a mood disorder, and it's these episodes that can be triggered by the environment, but it's ultimately a mental health issue. You can have a depressive episode even if there is no external stressor. If you have no reason to be depressed. Who's heard that phrase before? It just happens. Burnout is a response to that environment where expectations are unsustainable and unreasonable based on what you're capable of handling. Burnout is caused by that overextension. And that can trigger depressive episodes, but ultimately burnout is caused by the environment, whereas depressive episodes, we could fix a lot of things in our society, which would lead to less depression, but not necessarily no depression. How long does burnout last? I unfortunately don't have a good answer to that. I wish I did. But it varies. And part of the reason why it varies is capitalism. Essentially, the primary way to be less burned out is to have that space to rest and recover. And very few people are in a position to say, I need to take 3 months off to recover from burnout. That might be what you need, but you might not be able to do that and still have a place to live or have a job to go back to. So this gets perpetuated by people who are in burnout, but are in that cycle of going back too soon because I literally can't afford not to. And that can make it drag on and on. I know friends who have said that it took years to come out of burnout. So there's not a simple answer to that, unfortunately. I spoke quite a bit on the myth of going back to normal. So for the sake of time, excuse me, And then, is there a link between burnout and menstrual cycles? Actually, autistic and AuDHD individuals who have a menstrual cycle, one of the things that we are more likely to have is PMDD, that premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that basically depression caused by or mood disorder caused by, triggered by hormonal shifts for the menstrual cycle. So not just someone might get PMS and be a little cranky, but an actual like mood episode. We're more prone to having those. We can also have more other issues related to our cycle. Specifically, I don't know if it published, but I was part of an interview for a qualitative study on autistic people in puberty and how the menstrual cycle specifically is rougher for us going through puberty because of the sensory issues. So it can absolutely be a stressor that adds to burnout. Each person's experience of burnout is unique on an individual level, just like each autistic person's experience as an autistic human is unique. Each ADHD person's experience as an ADHD human is unique. That means that burnout is going to be unique. So currently, when I talk about neurodivergent burnout, I am using it as an umbrella term for these burnout experiences, and there is symptom overlap. I would love to see more research on the differences with different neurotypes. I'm sorry, I am going to be mindful of the time, but this is just a tool that I use with myself and often with my clients for at what level is your burnout. Because part of masking is often disconnecting from our own needs, because I can be aware that I have, like, let's say the lighting in my office is really distressing and sensory overwhelm for me, but I don't have the option to say, can we please dim the lights? I can be aware that it's very, very uncomfortable, possibly even painful for me, or I can disconnect myself and not let myself be aware of the way that the light is hurting me. So sometimes burnout seems to hit very quickly because when we're in these lower stages, I have a little bit of burnout right now, I'm not even letting myself acknowledge it until it's so bad that I'm going to shut down. So I think that it can be helpful to think of it as, I'm starting to touch on burnout, I should take some steps to rest and to kind of keep my level down. And there is both primary and secondary prevention. There's what do I need to do in order to not become burned out? What are my limits? What do I need to say no to? And then when I start to get burned out, how do I come out of that before it reaches that crisis point? And that answer is going to be different for everyone. So just some general information on burnout recovery. It takes as long as it takes. Need to be patient with yourself. If you have the capacity to give yourself the space for full rest, that might be what you need. But I want to just acknowledge and name that that's not realistic for everyone. You know, I'm not saying that you've failed if you're like not able to do that, but this is ideal. Changing expectations, you know, realizing what do I need to change long term to bring down the impact of this on myself. And knowing that it's not linear. It might not be like I'm a little bit better every day. It might be today, you know, it fluctuates day to day. You can go at your pace. You can find even if it's something tiny, what demands can I reduce on myself? Who do I trust? Who supports me? And where can I feel safe unmasking? Some common questions that I get around coping with burnout. There can be a lot of shame because I used to be able to do this. Why can't I anymore? Or I feel ashamed to express that I have a need. Maybe I've never had the space to feel like I'm allowed to do that. So being that self-compassion and that self-care, and acknowledging those negative self-talk, negative monologues to kind of bring that back down. And explaining burnout to other people. A lot of times people will, that invalidation of everybody's stressed out. okay, this is different though. This is more than that. Everybody gets nervous at some point from something. Not everybody has an anxiety disorder. We're talking about two different things. Also, it's not your job to educate people who don't get it. You're allowed to set a boundary around that. But if you are trying to explain it to a loved one who you feel truly wants to get to the point of understanding, that's valid. That's okay too. And there's no one coping skill that's right for everybody, but trying out different things and seeing what works for you from a place of non-judgment. It's okay to say this doesn't work for me specifically. And, rest, finding places of rest where you're able to, because again, it's not an option for everybody. And then finally, this is one that I run into all the time, balancing my need for rest and my need for stimulation. Rest doesn't necessarily mean no stimulation or input, but I will say it is possible to be overstimulated and understimulated at the same time. So finding the sensory input that works for you without overwhelming you. And that's going to be different for everybody. Now, once we are looking at the future and breaking that cycle, noticing what is triggering burnout, what is draining for us individually, living authentically, unmasking where we can, being in environments that fit our needs, you're allowed to set boundaries. And you're allowed to say, here is what I'm capable of, here's the demands that I can take on, and here's what I can't. And you can, it absolutely is essential to redefine ideas like productivity, or like, what do I need? What do I need to do to contribute to society? Well, first of all, even if you don't at all, you're still valid and worthy as a human being. But, being able to give yourself that grace. I know I'm guilty of this all the time, that I literally said right now, even if you don't contribute to society, you're still valid. And then my brain goes, yes, but you still need to. Like everybody else, it's okay, but you still need to. Like countering that voice, that monologue. Just some things to keep in mind with children and teens. I'm sorry, I'm talking more than I was supposed to. But the number one thing with parenting is that attachment. So first and foremost, your child knowing that you're there for them and you love them and you're there to take care of them. And then everything else can come afterwards. So I know a lot of parents will say, well, the rest of the world is not going to be so kind. Okay, but your mom still can be. And ought to be. So just to be mindful of the time, I'm gonna shout out Supernova Parenting is a great resource for neurodivergent friendly parenting to check out. But attachment being that first and foremost, that number one piece of that connection to your child. Before we jump into the Q&A, I'm going to do a little self-plug here. I've written a bunch of books, but one in particular that I wrote came out 2 weeks ago. Neurodiversity Affirming Therapy, What Every Mental Health Provider Needs to Know, is a shift on the medical model. We want to empower neurodivergent clients and not try to force fitting into that neurotypical mold. It's written for mental health providers, but it definitely has information that can be beneficial to people who just want to better understand neurodivergence and different brains and the challenges that come with existing as a neurodivergent person in a neurotypical world. I've got some information here to learn more about the work that I do. So, find me on social media. Would love to chat with you more. When I have the capacity, I do set boundaries around that too. So now I will turn it over to the Q&A, and I do apologize for going over time a little bit here.
Oh, Dr. Marschall, please do not apologize because that was an incredible presentation. I will just quote one of our listeners who wrote to say, thank you for this presentation. I feel it has been exceptionally validating and informative. And I hope you consider writing a book for ADHDers.
One step ahead of you.
Right. You're on top of it. Look at you with the productivity, right? Okay. Before we start the Q&A, I will quickly thank Inflow once more for sponsoring this webinar. And I will touch ever so quickly on the results from our survey at the very beginning of the webinar. We asked if you're tuned into the causes of your burnout, which of the following factors contribute? The top 5 were really neck and neck. So I will just touch on those. Number 1 was unrealistic expectations, self-imposed or external, right? And that was in the definition, right? Yep. Of burnout is expectations, not meeting abilities. And number 2 was people-pleasing tendencies. I feel that we could probably do a whole webinar on that topic. Then this masking and attempting to appear neurotypical. The difficulty setting boundaries and saying no. And finally, difficulty making time for self-care. So if these things have been stressors in your life, please know that you are not alone. And a lot of people did answer all of the above. So okay, so I'm gonna launch into the Q&A and start with a little bit of brass tacks, and that is we had quite a few people write in to say, but there was one in particular here that I will quote. Sure. She said she is 35 and been masking her whole life. She believes that she does have, that she is ADHD. However, I've been, quote, masking for so long, I don't even know how to begin unmasking in a public setting or for an evaluation. I'm afraid of being dismissed. Can you offer any advice to folks who are in the early process of seeking evaluation?
Yeah, so it's hard because when you've been doing it your entire life, you might recognize that it's happening, but there's that question of who even am I without the mask? And you know what, I'm not going to talk clinically. I'm going to tell you what I did. But something that someone said to me shortly after I got shortly after I was misdiagnosed, and I was asking, like, you know, is there more here that they didn't realize? And another autistic person said that they found it really helpful. The first thing they did to unmask was that they privately, by themselves in their house, just did some stims that they knew that other autistic people did. So they said that they just, like, privately in their own home just flapped their hands for 30 seconds. And they just started noticing, like, you know what, I've never, as far as I recall, I've never done these motions before, but wow, they do help me to self-regulate. So that's something that I did in my own house too, that I was starting to get stressed out, and I did some flapping and walked in a circle, and I was like, this actually is really helpful. And so some of the unmasking was just, I'm going to try something that someone else who's unmasked did and found helpful, and then I'm going to tweak it to see if it's helpful to me. I strongly believe that every single one of us should be safe to unmask and stim and be authentic in public. And also, I do recognize that we live in an ableist, discriminatory world, and those things go just, you know, me stimming in public carries very different risks than a person of color stimming in public. People think you're acting weird in public. Weird. I'm using the term, I'm not saying stimming is weird, but, you know, acting weird can lead to very real dangers for certain demographics. So sometimes, even though masking is not healthy, there are times that people do it because it's keeping them safe. So doing it on your own in private can help you start to recognize who you are without getting that backlash, even if it's just dirty looks all the way up to an actual dangerous confrontation. In the safety of your home can definitely be a good place to start that.
That is wonderful advice. Our next question is sort of the next step. How can I go about researching the right provider who is open to someone who is ADHD.
Mhm.
Most of those I've spoken with are kind
Mhm.
of, as you said, like it's only within the last decade that even the DSM has recognized that these two,
Mhm.
you know, conditions can exist in the same person.
Mhm.
Are there criteria or
Mhm.
questions that you can offer to help people discern that they are
Mhm.
seeking help from the right provider?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Because that's a hard thing because, when you get an evaluation, you're not going in and saying, I need you to tell me that I have this. You're going in saying, I need you to help me figure out if I have this. So, unfortunately, that means that providers who make mistakes, like if the provider's wrong, if the provider has a misconception about AuDHD, that like we face, it's the, when I say we, I mean me as like lived experience, face the consequences of that. So you are allowed to ask questions before you commit to scheduling with someone. Providers have different boundaries around their availability. For example, many do a 15-minute phone call where you can pick their brain. Phone calls are very draining for me just because of how my brain is. So a boundary that I set is I don't do those 15-minute consult calls, but potential clients are more than welcome to email me their questions and I will write a response to them. So questions you might ask first, I am very open about my diagnoses. It's not a requirement, I don't think, to self-disclose because it is personal information. Someone might not feel safe. And I will say, I did not publicly disclose my diagnoses until I was fully self-employed because that is when I felt safest to be open about that. I'm not going to fire me for having ADHD. So, some people don't feel safe being open, but you also have the right to seek out providers who have chosen to self-disclose that. You can ask them before scheduling, what's your experience with assessing someone in my demographic? Whether that's, your gender, your ethnicity, your cultural background, your age. You can say, what is your understanding and what is your experience of assessing someone like me? And you can ask them about neurodiversity affirming care, which is that understanding that neurodivergence is not a problem to be solved or something bad or shameful, and taking that more collaborative client-centered approach, recognizing, clients come to me for assessments. I don't always see them unmasked because they might not have figured out who that is, or they might not have felt comfortable enough with me to show me that side of themselves. And I strive to create an environment where my clients do feel comfortable showing me their unmasked selves, but I'm not entitled to that. For any reason at all, they might not feel safe showing that side of themselves to me. So ask them about their ability to assess someone who is high masking can be another question to ask.
So helpful. Thank you. And, I would like to just quickly really express my thanks to the audience here today. We have had more than 2,100 people, and we're up to 450 questions and comments. And they are among the most thoughtful that I've ever seen in my time at ADDitude, which is decades. So I'm getting, it makes me emotional. This is a really important presentation. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
I would like to
authentic here.
Thank you. Super authentic to the max. Okay. Another person wrote in to say, I feel like people don't fully believe me when I explain ADHD burnout, and that I'm just being dramatic. How do you counter people who belittle your experience?
Yes. So first of all, it is not your job to prove that you're struggling enough or struggling in the right way. And honestly and truly, there have been situations where someone has had that response to me, and I have said, well, if that's the way that you're going to interact with me, then you're not going to have the option of interacting with me. You're allowed to set that boundary because frankly, I don't have the capacity to explain to everybody and to justify what my needs are. I'm allowed to say, well, you don't have to get it. But I will often point people to other educational resources. It's also it's also a big part of my role to educate the general public. So I'll even point people to my own blog and I'll be like, well, I've written about this actually, but no one else is inside your brain except for you. Even your therapist, your significant other, the person who evaluated you, no one is inside your brain and knows your firsthand experience like you do. And some people are not going to get it. And that sucks. I was actually talking earlier today about people, about that autistic experience of not being understood and thinking, if I can just explain it just right, if I can just explain it better and give more information, then people will understand what I'm trying to say. And that's just not what's going to happen sometimes. So I try to keep a few like go-to educational tools and say, please look into this and understand why what you just said is very harmful. And if they're open to that education, then we can talk about it. And if they're not, then I say, well, in order to have access to my energy, you know, I'm not going to give you that access to me if you're going to talk to me that way.
I would like to suggest that this webinar, which we will send the replay link to everyone who registered later on today or early tomorrow, that this webinar would be an excellent resource to share for those who you think
send them my way.
Yeah,
this takes no additional energy from me because we've recorded it, so everybody can just watch it. We can just say, "Go watch this thing I already made."
Recycle, reuse. Let's go.
Yes.
Okay. Another listener wrote in to say that they are currently experiencing burnout in their profession, and after decades in that profession. And can you offer advice for investigating career paths that might be more affirming and sustainable?
So there's not a right answer to this because each person is going to have their own needs. Again, speaking to my own experience, being my own boss has been huge for protecting me from professional burnout, but not everyone is in a position to start a business, and not every line of work lends itself to starting a bit. I'm married to a nurse, and you can't be a freelance bedside nurse. Like, there's not really, the profession doesn't lend itself to that. So that's not an option for everybody. But I found, because then I can decide, here is what my scope of practice is. I've got nobody but myself, I will say. I do. Nobody pressuring me to work beyond my capacity, no external person giving me productivity requirements. So having that space where I am in control was huge for me. Although you do have to be able to set your own boundaries with that, because there's also an autistic tendency to have a job within your special interest, and go, and have difficulty stopping yourself until you overload yourself in that way. But working positions that have flexibility with things like being able to work remote, because in my house, I get to decide how bright the lights are. I get to decide what the volume is. I'm never going to forget my lunch again because it's in the kitchen over there. Things like that, creating, the environment that fits your sensory needs and being able to operate in that particular environment. If you're like me and you hate, meetings, finding jobs where those meetings are not mandatory, things like that. So kind of figuring out what's the ideal environment where you thrive, and then what job gives me that environment, basically.
Right. And that's not easy. Okay, I'm going to throw in one last question. It is tough to decide, but I wanted to recognize that, as you said, autism and ADHD are both highly genetic. And we have a lot of parents here who are AuDHD, who are burned out, parenting a neurodivergent child. And I wonder if there are specific resources, community support that can help with that population that obviously doesn't get a day off.
Right. Yeah. And, if you're a parent of a neurodivergent kid and you're like, you've never considered it for yourself, I'm not diagnosing you, but I cannot tell you how many times I've had a conversation with a parent being like, what do you mean my kid's ADHD? What do you mean my kid's autistic? I do those things too. And I say, yeah, about that. So getting to know yourself, because as a parent, you're really, really primed to, what does my child need? Put my child's needs first. And that's great. But when it's done to your own detriment, that can often lead to, you can't show up for your child if your needs aren't being met. I mean, you deserve to have your needs met as a parent, as a human being, like as a human being outside of your role as a parent. And also you can't show up as a parent unless you're also taking care of yourself. Having community support, that the whole, it takes a village, having other, even especially neurodivergent parents. A colleague of mine does a group for kids. And she shared that the parents of the kids in her group were in the waiting room while she was running the group, and she came out and they had started a group chat together to be able to give each other that support, which is really like a really cool experience. But finding your own community and your own support in that is huge. And even if it's not, if official diagnosis is not the safe option for you, at least, seeking out community of of people who, your people who get you, basically.
Speaking of which, thank you so much, Dr. Marschall, for bringing together this amazing community today. This has just been an incredible experience. I don't even call it a presentation because it's really been much more than that. Thank you so much for joining ADDitude, and I hope we can get you back because this was just an incredible webinar.
Yes, please.
And also, as I said, I really do want to thank today's listeners. If you would like to access the event resources, please know you can visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 556. The slides and the recording are posted a few hours after each live webinar. Share them with everyone you know. If you're listening in replay mode, simply click on the episode description for all of that good stuff, and know that our full library of ADDitude webinars is available as a podcast. It is called the ADHD Experts podcast, and it's available on most streaming platforms. We hope to see you again for a future webinar. Next week, we will be presenting for free, as always, healing from the impact of toxic or emotionally immature parents. Make sure you don't miss any future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates just by signing up for our newsletters at ADDitudemag.com/newsletters. And I would be remiss not to end by wishing everyone a happy Autism Awareness Month. We are in the final hours, and I hope that if anyone suggests that autism or ADHD is a health threat, that you point them to this webinar as evidence to the contrary. Dr. Marschall, thank you so much again for your insights. We hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you. You too. I'm so glad I could be here. Thank you.